Welcome to Divorce Explained, the podcast where we answer your questions and navigate the process of divorce together.
So we can go in many directions on the subject of travel with children, but let me just kick it off to begin with. When we used to discuss the subject of travel pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, it was a very different conversation. And now we have people that have governmental restrictions on travel. You have people that have, of course, what pre-existed COVID, which was the concern about taking children to places that are dangerous. But as a result of COVID, you have those saying, I don't want my child going to visit my in-laws in China or in other parts of the world where there's continued to be a sense of concern with respect to the safety and the safety protocols there. And then, of course, we've got the subject of travel, which obviously has always been an issue between separating parents as to whether the children are capable of being apart from another parent. So I'm going to invite you, Leanne, to take a stab at that or any of the other topics of travel that you may have thought about, given that you recently did travel as well.
Yes. Certainly I find travel issues are something that come up often enough with clients because, most parents at some point want to take their children on a vacation, and usually, that might mean going to a different part of, the country or outside the country altogether. So it is something that comes up. And one of the issues that arises as well is the travel documentation, because generally, a parent cannot take a child outside of Canada without the consent of the other parent. And so, one of the things that comes up is getting, the traveling parent needing the other parent to sign a notarized letter, saying that they agree or consent to the child traveling with them on these dates. And so that's something that, gets raised, and sometimes parties who are, into power and control and that sort of thing, will play games a little bit with providing that to their former spouse. So that's something that I've had to deal with clients on a number of occasions. And, just on the issue of travel, one concern, sometimes very legitimately that people have is that they're concerned that, if a parent wants to take a child to certain jurisdictions, like say, for example, they have family or roots in the Middle East and they want to take the children, to visit family, somewhere like that. And it's a country where, Canada, does not have, we don't have this, if a parent takes a child there and decides not to return, in Canada with certain countries, we don't have that sort of arrangement where the Canada will, help a parent, get the child back, and where somebody can be extradited and, potentially face abduction charges here for removing a child. So that's probably one of the most serious concerns that comes up, with some families where they are concerned about a child being removed and not coming back. Have you ever had cases like with that issue?
Yeah.
Steve?
So I'm going to comment on the subject of international child abduction in a moment. I had a recent case of that not only went to trial, but ultimately went to the Court of Appeal. So I'll speak to the subject of child abduction in a moment. But I find something very curious with respect to this concept of travel consent forms. Now, I want to preface this by saying I'm not an immigration consultant, nor do I understand enough about the laws with respect to crossing an international border with a child that is your biological child. But I can tell you this, in all the years that I traveled with my children when they were minors, when I did travel, I would then have their mother sign a travel consent form. And then, of course, as a lawyer, I would notarize it. I would make it look nice and official. I'd get to the airport or I'd get to the border at Buffalo, and I would have it in hand, ready to show. Nobody asked for it. And so it happened repeatedly that this occurred, that I would have it. Nobody asked for it. They would ask for the boarding pass at the airport and the passport. I would provide the passport and the boarding pass. Of course, my children have my last name and it was never an issue. We got on the plane, we got to wherever we went. Oftentimes it was just either the US, like Florida, or Mexico. Now, having said that, every separation agreement and almost every court order that we've ever dealt with respect to future travel planning includes a clause that says that the non-traveling parent will sign a travel consent form to permit the traveling parent to go with the child on the approved travel vacation. When I say approved, obviously, if it provides specifically that there is an allowance of travel, for example, every summer for a week or at Christmas time, then that's a sort of a pre-approval, but there still is this so-called requirement for a travel consent form. But when there are cases where somebody says, hey, you know what, I want to take the kids for a week to Disney World and they're going to miss 2 or 3 days of school, that's a situation where it actually disrupts the parenting schedule in the court order and requires approval before somebody can go ahead and do that. In the vast majority of cases, the parents are harmonious and cooperative, and what goes for one goes for the other. So, you know, if you start playing games, not allowing one person to travel with kids, next time around, it's going to come back and bite you. So what we lawyers often do is we encourage appropriate, responsible, reasonable travel with the kids, even if that involves missing a couple of days of school, because overall, it's for the happiness and the benefit of the family unit, and it goes both ways. Now, what about situations where the parents don't agree? Whether it's because one parent feels very firmly that the children should not miss school, or they don't agree with the destination, or they don't agree with missing their time, whatever the case may be, or what I said a few minutes ago about COVID and the restrictions there. In those situations where people cannot agree, they either mediate it, or they go to a parent coordinator, or they go to a court. They go to a judge, and the judge rules on that. And in cases where there's a ruling, you often don't need a travel consent form because you now have a court order or a separation agreement that gives you that authority to travel. But in situations where there is no such court order or written agreement with pre-approval to travel, this notion of the travel consent form comes in, which, as I said a few minutes ago, I am actually not certain that there is a legal requirement to have a travel consent form. Now, I don't want all of our viewers to think they go ahead and travel willy-nilly without the children, because the travel consent form is really another piece of evidence to prove that both parents allow this child to cross an international border. And so it's relevant in that respect, but is it absolutely legally necessary to present such a form at the border or in an airport? My personal experience is no, but I don't know.
I was just going to say, I've never been asked to produce one, but I can say that my ex-husband has. We were very young when we split up. My children were very young, so that could have been part of the reason. I don't know, but he has been asked to present it before. Whether legally they're allowed to do that or not, of course, is another issue. But I think, you know, I would say for our viewers that I don't think it's a problem you want to run into. So it's better to just be cautious and have the travel consent just in case, on that off chance you do get asked. You don't want to be arguing about legal issues when you're heading off on a night.
Story.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but like you said, we have many cases. Sometimes we're called, you know, days before a planned trip because the other side did not sign the travel consent form. And oftentimes these separation agreements or court orders will say that it should not be unreasonably withheld. Yet sometimes people are slow to respond, let's just say. And it causes anxiety to the traveling person. No different than, by the way, you're waiting for your passport to come back from Passports Canada and you don't have it, and you've got tickets and you're looking to board a plane. So it creates unnecessary anxiety. And so the best practice here is plan early, get cooperation, prepare the travel consent form. You don't need lawyers for that. You can go to the Government of Canada website. They have a prescribed form for travel consent. You can download it, print it off, and get everybody to sign it. And that way you are guaranteed to have no problems at the border, because you definitely do not want to arrive at the border or the airport and then you get one very nasty border guard who says, I'm not letting you on the plane or cross the border without proof that the other parent has consented. So that's a child consent form. Now, let's go to the other question that you brought up, Leanne, which is international child abduction. Now, it's not child abduction to travel with a child to another country.
No.
It's child abduction to try to change the habitual residence or the permanent residence of a child contrary to the other parent's agreement. And the Supreme Court of Canada doesn't hear that many family law cases, but in the last year, they heard a family law case on that very issue. And it was a case, it's initialized, and you can Google it and look it up. It's the Supreme Court of Canada decision from 2022. And in that case, a couple had children in Dubai, and the mother said to the father, I'm going to go visit family in Ontario. And upon arrival, she texted dad back and said, decided not to come back. And she immediately retained counsel. Dad in Dubai retained local Ontario counsel. And local Ontario counsel asked for an order to force the return of the children. Now, the husband, father, could not force the return of the mother, wife, but he could seek an order for the return of the children. Well, mother challenged that request and claimed that she and the children would be at risk of harm if returned. And so this went to the Court of Appeal, and then it went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that no, you cannot show up at a travel destination here in Ontario and claim jurisdiction here. What you ought to do is you should have gone to the courts in Dubai to get pre-approval to change the permanent residence of the children. And so it's a very interesting read. It's one of the few cases that goes up to the Supreme Court of Canada, but this one did, and it dealt with a situation where someone tried to reestablish jurisdiction and habitual residence of the children by claiming that going back, they would be put in harm's way. And it's an interesting read. Why? Because when the mom here made allegations about returning home being a situation of risk, the father, very smart, said, well, if that's so true, come back to Dubai. I will rent you a different apartment. I will pay for you to live there. That way you will be in Dubai with the children in your own residence. And that eliminated the ability for the mother to argue that being there would put her in harm's way, because all the father was saying is let the courts in Dubai deal with it. And the courts in Canada confirmed that.
Interesting case. And it is an issue that, it doesn't come up. It's not something we see, quite regularly. But I know, it's certain, people do have that concern because certain, as they say, with certain countries, it can be, especially countries where, say, men have more
Sharia
rights.
law applies.
Yeah.
Arabia,
it can be very problematic for a woman in that situation.
That's right. And so, interestingly, in this Supreme Court of Canada decision, it did allow a very small window, and it said that if the laws in the foreign jurisdiction are, and I'm using my own language, radically different than the laws of parenting here, a person could make an argument that the matter should remain in Ontario. Now, let's talk about the situation where it's the flip side. That was a case where a foreigner came to Ontario to try to establish jurisdiction here. But what about the case of Ontario families where one goes to another place, for example, Florida or England or Australia, and says the exact same thing and says, I am now here and I want to use, for argument's sake, UK law to remain in England. In a situation like that, the parent who is left behind, by the way, in the case law, it's oftentimes called the left behind parent. So the left behind parent would be prudent to immediately retain counsel, to immediately write a letter to mom or mom's counsel to say the children's place of domicile is Ontario. They are governed by Ontario law. you did not get permission to relocate outside of Ontario, and you would give them, say, 48, 72, 5-day window to return. And if they fail to return, then you can bring an emergency motion in Ontario court asking for the order of return. Now, this is where things get a little dicey for our viewers. You've got Hague Convention signatory countries, and you have non-Hague Convention signatory countries like the Supreme Court of Canada decision with Dubai. Now, where you've got a signatory, and by the way, anybody can Google which countries belong to the Hague Convention on the international rules for the abduction of children. So whether it's a Hague or a non-Hague, it's still smart if you're dealing with an Ontario child to immediately run to court and seek an order. If it is a Hague signatory country where the child is in, then the likelihood is even higher that the judge is going to make an order here. But the part that is the real kicker is the country who is a signatory to the Hague will enforce the Ontario order in the other jurisdiction. And that's not to say that the left behind parent isn't going to fly there to escort the children back, but it's not required because the authorities in the other country will enforce and implement the return order.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. If the country is a non-Hague country, then my understanding, and I haven't dealt with it specifically yet in my practice, is that, you know, it's going to help to have an Ontario order, but if you're not going to have another country enforcing it, it could be quite challenging to get the children back.
And indeed, in the Supreme Court of Canada case, the father could have gone to the Dubai courts and sought an order there. But at the end of the day, the order from the foreign jurisdiction, if it's a non-Hague signatory country, is not going to be useful in Ontario. So in the case that I referred to, that is a case where the father really had to swim in the Ontario pool and get the order in Ontario that could then force the Ontario authorities to require the children to be returned to Dubai. And by the way, if it were to be UK or Australia or United States, you would still go to the Ontario court and get such an order requiring the children to come back, and then you would have no problem enforcing it in the signatory country jurisdiction. So on the subject of travel, which, by the way, I love the word travel. The word travel makes me so happy because it evokes all of those positive feelings of, first of all, escaping Canadian weather in the middle of the winter. That's one. Two, it allows us to actually discover the way people live in other jurisdictions. So let's talk about that for a moment. Argentina. Argentina, just 2 years ago, legalized abortion. Argentina, just about 20, 25 years ago, allowed no-fault divorce. It's not that long ago. And so what I find so interesting when I travel is I obviously many times try to find a lawyer who's local because I have all these questions I want to ask them, like, how do you do things here? And, you know, what we do find, or at least what I found on my recent trip to Argentina, is that the ratio of marriage is very low. More people get married in the United States and Canada than in Argentina. Don't quote me on the numbers. And that speaks to a few factors. One, in terms of their socio-economic behavior, things are really tough for most people in Argentina and Brazil and Chile. Financially, things are very tough. Of course, there's the 1% there, but they have a really tough time. Inflation is out of control there, and this drips down into the decision to have children. So there are fewer people that marry, certainly more cohabit. They have few children, of course, except for for example, ultra observant religious people, like for example Orthodox Jews will have just as many children and Buenos Aires as they do in, say, Crown Heights, New York. But with the exception of those very small populations, the family sizes are generally very small because the cost of living is so high, and the cost and the incomes are so low, and the inflationary forces are so great. But one thing is very clear from what I saw when I was there and interviewed and spoke to people and gathered from what I gathered there, is that the parents are both very involved in the raising of children. And part of that is for the same reason that it occurs in countries like Israel. Because of the economic pressures being so great, oftentimes in intact marriages or even common law unions, both parents work, and both parents heavily rely on the grandparents to care for the children while both parents work. And in those cases where the parents split up, oftentimes the children end up in a shared parenting arrangement with both parents, because in both cases the parents were equally involved. It wasn't a situation like we find in the United States and Canada, where you have a primary caregiver and then somebody that's oftentimes out of the house 40, 50, 60 hours a week. And I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I didn't myself realize that the number of marriages was lower in some of these South American countries than it is here. So, as you said, Steve, it's always interesting to see the different cultures and customs and laws, in some of these countries when you visit. And I'm, like you, I'm always a little curious of, how family law matters are treated. And so that's really interesting, to hear that. And it's again, like, there's a lot of countries in this world where, like, the family unit, meaning also including extended family, is very important to the raising of children, and grandparents looking after children rather than children going to daycare and having nannies, and then parents looking after their parents and their children. And we, here in North America, we have a little bit less of that than, some other countries.
If anything, we have a daycare epidemic where people cannot afford daycare, but that presupposes that we use daycare, whereas in the countries that I visited, daycare is not that common, because it's the parents, I should say the grandparents, that are the daycare providers.
Yeah. No, and I think there's something nice about that, in a way that, keeping that there's that loyalty within the family, and the idea of helping your family. Of course, if you have a completely dysfunctional, horrible family, which people do, maybe that's not such a great thing. It sounds great in theory, but maybe sometimes in practice it's not always ideal.
Yeah, no, two small stories and then we'll wrap up. When I was in Buenos Aires, we stayed in a residential area, and there was a couple schools around there, and school ends early there. I think it was like 2 or 3 o'clock. And it was funny because, you go to a public school in Toronto at pickup drop-off time. Sometimes you'll see, a parent. Sometimes you'll see a nanny, a caregiver. There it was mainly grandmas and granddads picking up the kids.
Interesting.
Because I guess their parents were working. The other thing is, this has got to be the best divorce story I've heard in the last few months. I'm not going to say in my entire life. We had a driver in Mendoza, Argentina, who fortunately spoke fairly good English. And that resulted in him telling me all about his divorce. Fine. He has 2 children, 2 girls, and they split up a couple years ago. But when they got married, he owned the house that his wife moved into, and that they ended up living in as a couple. And not a particularly nice house, but it had a nice piece of land around it, as did Mendoza, Argentina is almost like the Napa Valley of Argentina. The houses there sit on larger pieces of land than, say, in the capital of Buenos Aires. So when they split up, they couldn't afford to buy one another out of the house. And so the way they resolved it was that they severed the lot. And so his house sits on the same lot as the house that she built. Now, because his house was at the top left corner of the rectangle, she put her house at the back right corner of the rectangle. And I asked them, how big is that? And we ultimately, through a little broken language and using meters and feet, realized that the land is about the size of 2 tennis courts. And so the 2 parents who split up ages ago, a couple of years ago, are immediate neighbors to one another with no fence in between. The children go back and forth fairly regularly, sometimes multiple times in one day. They'll have like lunch with dad and dinner with mom, because dad's a driver and he's got odd hours. Mom runs a massage therapy clinic out of the house. And so the kids go back and forth. The grandparents obviously are involved in taking them to school and this and that. But, you know, when mom's got a boyfriend coming over, boyfriend waves at ex-husband on his way in and vice versa. Now that is crazy.
That is crazy.
I said, what's the plan? He goes, well, once I make enough money, I'm going to offer to buy her out.
That's it's almost like a weird nesting arrangement, almost on some level, with
It's everyone
a little
loves Raymond turns divorce.
Yeah. That's a great story.
Anyway, so that's it for this week. Traveling with your children, make it easy, make it fun, get the papers all worked out early and easily so that there's no issues and glitches. And we wish everybody, just like Leanne and I had, safe travels should you be traveling.
Yes. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you here again next week on Divorce Explained. Bye for now.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Divorce Explained. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to head on over to Instagram and follow at Steve Benmor and at Leanne Townsend Life for more. And if you're looking for specific divorce services, you can visit benmor.com and leannetownsend.ca. We hope today's episode made you feel informed and inspired as you move along through your divorce journey. Tune in next week for Divorce Explained.